Café on Tampa online. We still can't meet in person, so we're glad that you all are joining us today online. Today we've got Del back. For you all who remember, Del is one of the key founders of Café on Tampa and has been the moderator at all of our sessions. And we've finally been able to drag him out to get him back online. So Del, say hi to everybody.
Hey, Bill, thank you for pushing me on to be on. I wasn't on because I wasn't interested. But first of all, I want to thank Bill for taking the initiative and putting Café con Tampa online. On behalf of the board of directors and the Café con Tampa community, we really thank you. My reluctance was my technological need to learn how to do Zoom. 66 days ago, I didn't know how to do Zoom. Now I'm doing Zoom meetings every day. So I'm happy to be back. And today we have one of my favorite Tampans, Rodney Kite-Powell. Rodney is the director of the Touch and Map Library at the Tampa Bay History Center, and he's got a lot to share with us. Welcome, Rodney.
Hey guys, and hello everybody out there. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Rodney, do you want to give us a quick update on, you brought some slides. The idea here is not just to tell us about history, although we may geek out on that in a few minutes, but tell us about pandemics over time and how Tampa Bay has faced pandemics before, please.
Yeah. So even though this is something that we haven't as a kind of living society dealt with, unless you've been to Africa or some other place where they've had these kind of pandemics somewhat recently, this is not the first epidemic or pandemic that has come through Florida. And so I have some images that I kind of put together. We'll show in a little bit. But the first pandemics that came through that we know of came through because the Europeans brought diseases here to when they first explored here in the 1500s, and it devastated the native populations. It's really one of the main reasons why the early North American continent was almost depopulated of its original inhabitants. Certainly Florida was.
Hey, Rodney, let me ask you, I want to ask you a question real fast and also tell everybody, if you're watching this, you can ask questions, Café con Tampa style, below the feed if you're watching on the computer, on the phone, or to the right if you're watching on the computer. And please ask us questions throughout. And the idea of this is that we want to share information that not everybody has access to. So please share this on your Facebook page with your friends and family so that other people can get access to it. Rodney, before you get into those slides, also, we were having a discussion just before we started here about was Ponce de Leon really the first European who landed here? Can you tell us a little bit about that? You have a new map, since you're the curator. You have a new map that's coming that proves that he probably was not, right?
Yeah. So I appreciate you kind of setting me up on that. So yeah, we acquired recently a map from 1511. It's called the Peter Martyr map. It was in a book that was published by Peter Martyr in the year 1511, and it is a map, really the first printed map of the Caribbean, but it's also the first printed map that shows any portion of Florida. It shows South Florida and the Florida Keys. And 1511 is 2 years before Ponce de Leon came to what we know as Florida and named Florida. And so it was identified as Bimini on the map, and that's what he was looking for. So it's very clear that the Europeans knew about the Florida landmass and likely had visited Florida before Ponce de Leon.
And does that map say Bimini on it?
Yeah. And so it says it in the description on the reverse side. There's a pretty thorough description of the map. And the thing is the Spanish hierarchy did not want this information out. And so the reason why this map is incredibly rare is the King of Spain recalled all of Martyr's books and had that page removed from that book before they could be reissued. And then it was republished in 1515 without that map. So there are only a handful of these printed maps that are still available. And there's a collector in Chicago who donated it to the History Center because of our map collection and the importance of our collection to the map world, and because of the importance of that map to the map world. So we are thrilled to have that.
What was the reason for removing the map?
So the Spanish didn't want the other European powers to know what they knew. And Spain basically had everything to the west of what was called the line of Tordesillas. And so the Pope basically split the Western Hemisphere and the Atlantic Ocean, Western Atlantic, in half. Half went to Spain, half went to Portugal, which is why Brazil is Portuguese. But as the Spanish explored, they didn't want the information of that exploration to become knowledge, because then more people would want to go, particularly other European countries, the Portuguese in particular, the Dutch, French, and English. And so, so any information that got out was like a national secret getting out. And so Martyr should have known that. He was actually pretty high in the Spanish court. He's lucky he didn't lose his life over it. But again, as a result, that map became very rare.
Yeah, we'll have to geek out some more about maps in a minute, but why don't you show us your picture and tell us about the pandemic also?
Sure. So yeah, so we could maybe do a whole nother one of these with the Martyr map. But let me get to where I got to go here.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, Tom Touchton helped me buy some maps from his dealers, and they're not as expensive as you might think, although he's got some very expensive ones. And maps really tell a story. And I think they're at the History Center because of the collection that he and his wife donated. I think it's the largest collection of Florida maps in the world.
It's the largest single collection of Florida maps that are now in kind of institutional hands.
You can't go to any reputable antique map dealer in the world and mention Florida and they don't know who Tom Touchton is. That's
they all know who Tom is for sure. And so and definitely interrupt me anytime as I go through these. But so I was saying, so the first epidemics to really sweep through the U.S. and Florida that we know of occurred when the Europeans arrived in the 1500s. There undoubtedly were epidemics that were endemic to North America prior to that, but we just don't know about them. And so, but the ones that we have knowledge of. And so this is an engraving from 1591 showing Florida in 1564. The French did come to Florida and try and start a settlement. And so this is some of the kind of healing practices of the Native Americans in Florida. And one could speculate throughout the eastern part of what is now the U.S. Tobacco smoke was thought of as healing, as was bleeding, which is something that Europeans as well thought was healing to some degree. Of course, they didn't have the remedies to smallpox and the other diseases that did run through, and so upwards of 90% of the native population was decimated by these diseases. Fast forwarding a bit through a lot of time, going to the 1800s, and the real problem epidemics that came through Florida in the 1800s, particularly the after the Civil War, when people began moving to Florida, was yellow fever. And so this is a drawing from a national magazine called Leslie's Illustrated Magazine, and it's from 1870 during one of the worst yellow fever epidemics to sweep Florida. And you see the figurative character called Yellow Jack, which is a nickname for yellow fever, of literally pulling Florida, embodied in this woman, into a grave. And you can see next to that, also going into the grave, is the word trade. And so showing not only that there is a human cost to yellow fever, but also an economic cost. And we're seeing that today, of course, with COVID-19, the economic impact that the epidemic has on us as a society, as well as the medical. And then you have Colombia, which is the United States, trying to come to Florida's aid to some degree. But at that point, there was no aid really. Their government spending wasn't nearly what it is today. There was no even knowledge of what caused yellow fever. They associated it with the summer months, the wet season, and with kind of swampy conditions. But they didn't realize it was mosquitoes that carried yellow fever. So in the absence of that kind of knowledge, people would burn tar in the streets. They would try and fumigate the mail. There were quarantines, pretty serious quarantines. There would be people who would be trying to take a train someplace, and there would be an armed militia who wouldn't let them off the train at certain places where there was no yellow fever, but they were in fear of it. And so there were a lot of the things that we fear going on happening back then, happening quite a bit back then. One thing that we're talking about today, assuming that having had COVID-19, you'll have an immunity to it. That was certainly the case with yellow fever. And so the state health department issued health certificates to survivors of yellow fever, like this one here. And it showed that the person carrying it had yellow fever and they were no longer a threat. And this one signed by Dr. John P. Wall, who was a Tampa guy, Tampa doctor, I believe father actually of Charlie Wall, the gangster. And Wall was one of those first physicians who actually did speculate that mosquitoes carried yellow fever. But having one of these health certificates was very important because it meant that you could go through any quarantine lines or most quarantine lines and had free mobility because it certified that you'd actually had yellow fever. And so the last yellow fever epidemic to really sweep through Tampa was the 1887-1888 yellow fever season. And that was a really important time. The railroad had arrived in Tampa, the cigar industry had arrived in Tampa, and Tampa was really growing as a city. There were around 2,000 people in the city at the time, up from around 700 in 1880. And during this epidemic, there were around 1,700 cases of yellow fever and around 150 deaths. So in a population of 2,000, having that many deaths is pretty appalling. And so it's one of those things that while we obviously need to be very careful and be mindful of the rules we should follow today, the numbers that people faced back then were just astonishing compared to what we're facing today. Oak Lawn Cemetery in downtown Tampa has an area which was a mass grave for yellow fever patients because they did not want to spend a lot of time with funerals. They wanted to get the dead buried as fast as possible. And so they had just this mass grave in Oak Lawn for yellow fever victims. Sorry about the quality of this image, but even if the yellow fever had been tamed, they still had quarantine stations. Of course, Tampa is a port of entry and has been for a long time, and this was a quarantine station at Egmont Key. And so quarantining people coming in was still a very important practice, even in the early 1900s. And so that's when this photograph would have been taken. And so they were actually, in addition to quarantine stations, there were isolation hospitals throughout the state in the early 1900s because smallpox was still an issue, but not nearly an issue as the Spanish flu. And so this is kind of what they called so-called Spanish flu. Didn't originate in Spain, but Spain was the first country to really announce a lot of cases, and so it became associated with Spain. And so 1918 and 1919, we've heard a lot about the Spanish flu, but that swept through in two major phases in 1918 and then recurring in the winter of 1918, 1919. And so I just have a few newspaper stories and a couple of pictures to show that relate to this. And you read these articles and there's just some incredible similarities to what people went through 100 years ago and what we're going through today. Closing schools, wearing masks, limiting, the hours of work, quarantines. They didn't shut the economy down to the scale that has happened with COVID-19, but for them, it was an incredible adjustment to make, just like for us now. But one thing that made this worse was the world had just finished World War I, and that also is one of the reasons why it spread so quickly, because you had all these soldiers together who'd never been that far away from home and moving around and then coming back to their home country. And so like a place like Tampa that had experienced the loss of the Coast Guard cutter Tampa with 100 or so sailors aboard, including a few dozen Tampans aboard in September of 1918, then to have the influenza epidemic, it was really, really difficult for the area to bear that. And then again, from a number standpoint, in October, November of 1918, which was kind of one of the peaks of the epidemic, in Tampa alone, you had 283 fatalities from the Spanish flu. So it was a really bad epidemic. And unlike COVID-19, as far as we know, which generally hits the elderly the hardest, the Spanish flu or the 1919 flu epidemic hit younger people the worst. And so you had not only a hard hit from the war with young people, particularly young men, but you also had this flu epidemic that affected the young particularly severely. Another shot, this is a Tampa, relating the Tampa flu. There's a person here who is the first Tampa fatality. He actually died though in New York, not in Tampa. Again, people restrictions. There actually were no laws about spitting on the sidewalk, and this is actually when laws about spitting in public were introduced to help curb the epidemic. Apparently, spitting was quite a problem at the turn of the 20th century, and so there's a story about this guy who got out of control at a place called Tivat Brothers, which was a store on Franklin Street in downtown Tampa. And then this ad really caught my eye. For those watching and recognize the name Moss Brothers, Moss Brothers was really the department store in Tampa for close to 100 years. And so they put an ad in the paper saying that they're closing early to comply with the orders that were going on in the day. And then,
Rodney, it's kind of interesting. You said in the fall of 1918, about 283 people passed away. That's about, and I don't really know the exact number, I should before I bring this up, about the number of people from Tampa, Hillsborough County that lost their lives in World War I. And there was a monument built in Tampa for this, citizens that lost their, actually 2 monuments, they still exist. Was there any type of monument or acknowledgement for the citizens that lost their lives during this influenza?
As far as I know, no. And so those monuments you mentioned, Del, yeah, they're right now they're on Del Mabry and Kennedy at the Veterans Cemetery, and then down by West Shore Plaza on Kennedy, just past West Shore. That marked the beginning and the Hillsborough end of Memorial Highway, what was basically the extension of Kennedy Boulevard to Clearwater, really. And that.
By the way, if anybody's just logging in, this is Rodney Kite-Powell from Tampa Bay History Center, who's talking about prior pandemics. If you want to ask a question, if you're watching on your phone, post it underneath the video feed. If you're watching on your computer, post it to the right. We'll try to get them as many as we can. And also, we want to make sure that all this information is shared widely. That's the reason why we do it. So please share it on your Facebook page with your friends and family. Thanks. Rodney, back to you.
Yeah, so thanks, Bill. So the main loss of life for World War I and Tampa residents was that the USS Tampa, the Coast Guard cutter that sank. But yeah, if you include all the casualties, Army and Navy casualties, Coast Guard casualties, 200 sounds about right for World War I casualties for Tampa Bay area residents. And so yes, you have another equal number of people die of this disease, and those numbers at 283 was only for October and November of 1918, and so it was a real severe epidemic that swept through. This last shot I have here from the epidemic is an advertisement for Father John's medicine. So people were taking advantage of the situation by kind of selling patent medicine at the time. I can't imagine what it would have done for you. Probably had cocaine or heroin or morphine, something like that in it, because that was available at the time. And then, we talk about masks, and it's obviously kind of a hot button issue. But there are a few pictures of people wearing masks from 1918, 1919. These are newspaper boys from North Florida, and then a group of telephone operators. Telephone operators were critically important in the early years of the telephone system. And so these are all Southern Bell telephone operators from Jacksonville. And their job was essential in our, in the problems of our times. So they had to go to work, but they all wore masks. That was kind of something we would see today. Moving on from the Spanish flu, I was thinking, kind of how do we make this a little more current than the Spanish flu, which was 100 years ago. And so one of the things I thought about, and so how I think we'll end unless there's questions, which I'm happy to hear, was tuberculosis. And so that's not really talked about a whole lot, but the tuberculosis is another communicable disease. It's a bacteria, and it affects the lungs, and so it's similar to COVID-19. And there were hospitals that were set up by the state in the 1950s to combat tuberculosis. And the state had a law that you could commit somebody against their will if they had tuberculosis, regardless of their desire to enter the hospital. This is a W.T. Edwards, a name that might be familiar to people out there, and people of my generation in Tampa see that or hear that name and they think of the juvenile detention. But prior to it being that, it was the tuberculosis hospital. And interestingly, I didn't know this until doing research for this. All of the TB hospitals in Florida were named after W.T. Edwards, who is one of the leading state health officials. I thought there was only one, but every one of them had the same name, which is kind of interesting, and all had the same architecture. And there's TB is still something that exists today. It is still a disease that is being battled, although the numbers are far, far lower than it used to be. But it's still an illness that was long feared. It was called consumption. If you ever hear about somebody having consumption in the 19th century, that's tuberculosis as well. It's something that we haven't completely defeated medically, but it has gotten a lot better. And so these types of hospitals are no longer necessary. And so, hope, a little bit of hope, for us as we go through this. Y'all have any
Great. Well, if anybody online has any questions, like I said, you can post it underneath the feed or to the right, depending on how you're watching it. In the meantime, I'm sure Dell and I have lots of questions in the next 10 minutes here. Dell, you want to start?
Well, one of the things, in addition to TB, and I remember that W.T. Edwards Hospital, it's where the HCC Dale Mabry campus is now.
Exactly.
And I was a kid, but I think as you said, if you were diagnosed, you didn't have a choice. That's where you went, and that was the way it was spread. Another disease that I remember as a very small child, and the fear of it, was polio during the summer months. Yeah,
exactly. My grandfather had polio. He survived it, but it affected him the rest of his life. And that absolutely, until there was a vaccine for polio, it was an incredibly feared disease because it is a disease of paralysis. And so including, of course, paralyzing your respiratory system, but it affected my grandfather and many others by limiting the use of his legs. And so even though he survived it, it was still something that was very difficult on people. And so you're absolutely right, Del. That was a greatly feared disease.
I was about 9 years old when the vaccine became available. And I remember my parents taking me downtown to the health department for the vaccination, because that was a tremendous fear of all parents. So we've lived through these before.
You have that scar still on your arm?
No, that was smallpox.
Oh, well, I thought polio did too. I thought polio left in the earlier ones left kind of a nasty.
Whatever it was, it's gone. But I remember it, I'm going to my 20s, it stuck around.
Yeah. We've got a question from the floor. We got a question from the floor. And Rodney, in the meantime, you might want to take the presentation down.
Yep, just did.
We got a question from the floor. Why has the economy taken such a hit today when it seemed to be okay during the Spanish flu? Is that because the economy today is so different, or were different measures taken?
I think it's the level of shelter in place that was enacted for today, COVID-19, as opposed to the Spanish flu. But also the economy was different. But one thing that didn't close during the Spanish flu, I keep calling it that, I really shouldn't call it that, was this, in Tampa, the cigar factories. The cigar factories remained open, and but it also likely led to the much higher death rate and infection rate. But you had the closing of schools, just like we do today, and that was certainly a big consideration. But you didn't have just the almost complete shutdown of our economy like you do today. But there definitely was a limitation.
What were the main drivers of the economy back then?
The cigar industry was huge then, as was phosphate shipping out of the port and lumber shipping out of the port. And so, of course, the tobacco came in and cigars came out of the port as well. But the cigar industry was the main driver for Tampa's economy. We had, we were a bit of a banking center, a business center, but without a doubt, it was that cigar industry. We had hardly any tourist economy to speak of.
How big was our economy at late 1800s compared to Key West and Miami?
So Tampa had just kind of taken the lead over Key West in the 1890s. And so Tampa's funny as far as you look at that kind of population numbers and the size of the city. We've always been geographically small, I guess, until Greco, annexed a lot of North Tampa back in the 90s. We've been very, very geographically small. So when you include the suburbs, Tampa was generally beginning around 1900 and consistently through the 20th century, kind of second, third largest city in the state. There may have been a little bit of time where we were the largest, but always vying with either Jacksonville and Pensacola, or of course Miami, beginning in the 1920s for the status of the biggest and most important city in the state. But kind of traditionally, Jacksonville, Miami, and Tampa always are the big three.
Someone posted a comment, not a question. She says her neighbor failed to vaccinate his young son for polio, and his son became paralyzed from the disease. He obviously regretted that his whole life. It's so important to vaccinate.
Yeah, of course, that's what we're all waiting for. That's the thing. People ask, rightly, when can things get back to normal? If we ever find what a new normal is, and vaccine, short of knowing that you can gain an immunity and a long-term immunity to it, that's the key. And so being able to know that you're vaccinated and safe from it, that's how things will get back to normal.
We had one of my friends from Panama watching a few minutes ago, and so I'll ask this question: did Balboa ever come in this area, or just
no, just down there?
Okay.
Yeah, we had kind of our big three were of course Ponce de Leon, who didn't make it quite this far north, Panfilo de Narvaez, and then Hernando de Soto. So those were our guys. And then actually Pedro Menendez de Aviles, the guy who founded St. Augustine, he made it to Tampa too in 1566. Tried to start a colony about where Safety Harbor is, but it didn't succeed. But if it did, we'd be second oldest city in the state.
Tell everybody real fast about the Diary of Esteban. You all have a little display about that, but can you?
Yeah, and it's actually kind of timely because I just saw in the Times that Richard Gonzmart's putting Eulalie back on the Riverwalk or near the Riverwalk, and so with the Narvaez expedition in 1528, it was a brutal, awful expedition that ended up in Mexico, but only 4 survivors. But there was a guy. One of those 4 survivors was an African-born man named Esteban, likely the first African-born person of African descent to cross the country. He did that with 3 others. One of them being Cabeza de Vaca, who wrote the whole story of that journey down. And then looking for these people, though, particularly looking for Narvaez, was this guy named Juan Ortiz, who came to the area a year later, trying to find what happened to them. And he and his companions were all killed. Ortiz was taken captive, and so the story goes, his life was spared by the chief's daughter, whose name was Eulalie, which is where the restaurant name comes from, and where the statue that Richard's putting back on the Riverwalk is named for him. It's in the story of Eulalie and Juan Ortiz is very similar to the Pocahontas John Smith story, only ours happened 100+ years earlier.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that those 4 escaped and over 10 years made it all the way around to Mexico and
the Pacific side of Mexico. It's just incredible.
What else? We have a couple more minutes. Any other cool history bits you can throw at us? Anything about Tampa that we would like to know but we don't know?
Well, I want to ask Rodney a question, getting back to the pandemic and the Tampa Bay Hotel.
Yeah.
Did the Tampa Bay Hotel remain open during the pandemic?
Well, so that's actually a great point, though, because Tampa Bay Hotel, which is now University of Tampa, was really the landmark hotel in Tampa, but its history, its importance, I should say, as far as a hotel, fits right between the 2 great epidemics. The last yellow fever epidemic, like I said, ended in 1888, and it was at that time that Henry Plant announced that not only was he not going to leave Tampa for a healthier environment, because he's the one who brought the railroad here, he was going to build this resort hotel. So he kind of doubled down on Tampa and showed how much faith he has in the city, and he built the Tampa Bay Hotel. But by the time of the flu epidemic of 1918 and 1919, the hotel, which was the first thing in opulence, had become passé, and the city had already acquired it, and it was a city hotel that was being used not just seasonally by wealthy Northeasterners, but was being used year-round by kind of your more ordinary traveler. And as far as I know, the hotel remained open the whole time. I honestly don't know. You can contact the Plant Museum, They probably have a better sense of their history during the flu epidemic of 1918 and 1919. But I don't think that they closed.
Rodney, we're out of time, and we
Okay.
so appreciate you doing this. You come to talk to us about once or twice a year, and people always
pleasure.
ask you more questions, and so we'll have to have you back to do one of these online ones again too.
Okay.
If anybody is just watching or watching later, please share with your friends and family on Facebook or wherever, because the reason why we do this is to share information widely. And the Tampa area's got such a rich history. We need to continue to tell more of these stories, and we just barely touched on this today. Thanks, Del, and welcome back. Rodney, any final thoughts or words or websites you want to tell us about?
Well, yeah, so I got to plug the History Center. We open back up June 1st. So please go to our website, tampahistorycenter.org, or give us a call. You can kind of rewind a little bit and see those slides. I have the website and the phone number. We've got a whole list of things that we're doing to keep everybody as safe as we can. Of course, nothing's 100%, but we want to show and tell everybody kind of what we're doing. And if they're curious about what it's going to be like coming back to the History Center, just give us a call or go online and come back and see us June 1st.
Great. Thank you so much again. And thanks, Del. We'll see you